Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, and then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Alyssa Bream, and we're looking at a passage from Genesis 33, and we're talking about forgiveness and dysfunction. So Jacob sends some messengers ahead of him to inform Esau that he is approaching, and when the messengers return, they tell Jacob that his brother is sending an envoy to meet him. The implication is that this was a military envoy. So this scenario is kind of filled with suspense. The reader's not certain what he or she is about to read. Is it going to be a bloody battle where Esau takes the life of Jacob? Is Jacob going to have to turn tail and run and hide? We're just not certain. And the tension is created because the last words Esau said and the last actions he did before this scene. So his last words were in chapter 27, verse 41. He says, "From that time on, Esau hated Jacob because their father had given Jacob the blessing. And Esau began to scheme, I will soon be mourning my father's death. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." It's clear that he is full of hatred and he wants to murder. His last action was in chapter 28, verses 8 and 9. It says, "It is now very clear to Esau that his father did not like the local Canaanite women. So Esau visited his uncle Ishmael's family and married one of Ishmael's daughters, in addition to the wives he already had. It is clear he's in rebellion here." So Esau's been wronged, and in that culture, Esau would have been completely within his rights to take revenge upon his brother and give him what he deserves. But to our complete surprise, there's been this major change in Esau's character. So because the storyline has followed Jacob, we are completely clueless as to the events that led to Esau's change of heart. While Jacob does not know what has occurred to create such a transformation in his brother, he attributes it to God in a very unusual way. In chapter 32, verse 20, it records Jacob's plan. Jacob thought, "I will try to appease him by sending gifts ahead of me. When I see him in person, perhaps he will be friendly to me." There's an interesting Hebrew expression that is behind the phrase, "I will try to appease him." In the original language, Jacob would have said, "I'll cover his face with an offering that goes ahead of my face. Then afterward, when I see his face, maybe he'll lift my face." When Jacob wrestles with God, he mentions that he has seen God's face. Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." Once Jacob realizes that his brother's reception of him is not to end in his own death, he says, "And what a relief to see your friendly smile. It is like seeing the face of God." Because of the repeated uses of the word face in the Hebrew text, Jacob is implying that in some way his brother has had a similar experience to his own. He can now see God's face in Esau's. The solution to this familial dysfunction is total forgiveness. There really is no other cure for dysfunctional relationships. So, is it naive or oversimplified to suggest that the cure for dysfunctional relationships is total forgiveness?
I think that is the only starting point that is possible if you want to move forward. Now, I think the good caveat here would be if there is continued dysfunction, if the person, like if Jacob had come here and started lying again, or if there had been, continued things that he was doing that were wrong, then maybe there needed to be some separation. But I think when both parties are willing and there's total forgiveness, that is the only way that relationships can heal. And I think the word that is the modifier there, total forgiveness, is the key, because it's easy to want to forgive, to think that forgiveness is the ideal, but then not actually do the total forgiveness part. And it's forgiving again and again. And every time that becomes, in a relationship, but you did this, like that can't be the reply after there's that total forgiveness. You have to want to be well in that relationship. It's that question again that we talked about earlier this week. I found a scientific study that they did on forgiveness. where the three options that people had these were with high schoolers and bullying. So they played a video of them, and then there was three options that they had after it. One was forgiveness, one was ignoring it, and the other was revenge. And revenge was just a horrible option. It didn't really help, but they saw that forgiveness was actually the most stressful for the person, that their all of the physiological signs of stress were there, but it led to a better outcome in the long run. And there's so many scientific studies on forgiveness that it helps you as a person. So when you're dealing with forgiveness, it helps the relationship, but it really is about you being whole as a person and not harboring those thoughts and that anger and that bitterness that will grow and continue to grow unless you deal with it.
Yeah, even when reconciliation isn't possible,
Mm-hmm.
or even when it shouldn't happen,
Right.
So when I say it's not possible, maybe it's a parent or a loved one who's passed,
Mm-hmm.
and they could have or should have and didn't. You know, forgiveness is beneficial for the
Right.
person who does it. When it's a situation where they're not changing and it's not healthy for you to be in the relationship, forgiveness is still
Right.
necessary for you to remove the dysfunction in your own life. Otherwise, you become that bitter person we talked about a couple of days ago.
Mm-hmm.
And unforgiveness is it is at the root of bitterness. After I preached it, I used a quote, but I've thought about it more. I wonder if the root of bitterness that Paul talks about is not unforgiveness. Like, if that is not the root of it, where we just haven't dealt with the forgiveness piece
Right.
of it, because if we don't, it just builds and builds and builds and builds and get worse.
I saw a story, like dysfunctional family TikTok is like videos that I like to watch, like just stories of like crazy family kind of things. And
Jerry Springer on TikTok.
well, normally it's not. It's like just like straight to camera telling the story. And there's this person, and I started, you're scrolling through, and this person is like so excited they received a letter, and it was from their uncle who had murdered their parents when they were a baby. She was a baby in the house, and the uncle, there was some massive family dysfunction, and in front of the baby, he murdered both of the parents. And she was so excited to receive this letter because she had gone through that forgiveness now, and she was like, it's not going to do me any good to know why this murder happened, but she just wanted to have some sort of connection, just to tell him like that she forgave him. But she talked about how other members of her family never forgave him, and they just sat in that bitterness. And this was not a Christian. I have no idea of this person's faith. They were just telling the story, but they sat in that bitterness, and it had ruined their life because they just didn't want to forgive this person. Now, what that person did was horrible, and obviously that changed her life dramatically and caused a whole bunch of dysfunction in that family. But that choice she made to forgive changed her life. And it was so crazy to see. And people were like, why are you so excited to receive a letter from the person who murdered your parents? And she explained about the forgiveness, and like I said, and it wasn't like a preachy TikTok, but right. Forgiveness, whether you are a Christian or not, is core to being healthy.
Yeah, 100%. And you can tell when they haven't forgiven because it's always at the surface. Mm-hmm. Like the least little thing, it's like, touch it, and it comes spewing out. They relive it all over again. What happens? How do you think this turns out if either one of them, it doesn't really matter, Esau or Jacob, comes back without being submissive and to the other.
I think it would have just kept that family dysfunction even more. I mean, the crazy thing is thinking about these patriarchs in Genesis and the stories. When we did season 1 of One Single Story, I was trying to read alongside doing these podcasts. Now, you were able to do that. You were able to keep these stories separated. As we were recording, like, probably like this story, but we're reading, a few chapters back, and I'm like, wait, this person lied about this same thing. And you could see how the person, like the lies of Abraham about Sarah to the leader, like, oh, she's my sister, and then how that like goes down. And then next we're gonna see Joseph and all of the trouble that he gets in. But I think it was, Joseph would have been alive, right, during this.
Joseph is watching this.
Right.
Yeah.
And that example of forgiveness is probably how Joseph is able to forgive his brothers later on.
Yeah, I preached a sermon on this, and there are very few sermons like I have heard somebody else preach and said, I'm going to preach that as close as I possibly can. And I think I've preached it twice. But the person I heard preach was Andy Stanley. And so he's talking about Joseph forgiving his brothers. He's teaching this whole lesson. And then he said, where did he learn it from? And he goes right back to this story because Joseph was the favorite, right? He didn't just become the favorite when he turned 17. He was the favorite right now, right? And so if there's one of them, Andy weaves this story about if there's one of them that's hiding behind Jacob, it's Joseph, right? And so he's peeking out and he sees the only stories he's heard up until that point is my brother hates me. He's going to kill me. And then suddenly, is this embracing, weeping, rejoicing, forgiving. We do set that tone. Our kids are watching whether we forgive. Our kids are watching whether we get bitter. Our kids are watching whether we get better, all of those things. And it may not come out in their life until 20, 30 years later, but it's going to come out. And that's how dysfunction either starts or is repaired. Is when they see those things.
There has to be that stop. There has to be somebody in your family that is in the generations when there's dysfunction that's passed down and passed down. There has to be somebody that breaks that cycle and deals with it and has forgiveness and works through the hard things and changes the next generations.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, good. Thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us on Monday as we continue a conversation around our daily Bible reading.